Alright, here's another example, now this time with the cosine function. So the same thing's going to happen. I'm going to find my midline. So this got a vertical shift. This, again, I talked about this before. This is in the parentheses. This is not. So this is our vertical shift. So I'm going to write y equals 1. And that is my, I'm going to dash it because it's not really there. That's my midline. And now the points that I need, I'm going to make a table like I did last time. What I typically write here are the first thing is the initial point on the cosine. So at 0, typically the cosines are equal to 1. At 2 pi, 1 full period, the cosine is back to 1. Right in the middle, which would be pi, that's the initial point, the full period, half period. Alright, we are at the minimum on cosine. And for the quarter points, we're going to go, this is the middle point, this is halfway. Let me zoom out so we can see. I'll have to come back to this in just a little bit. This is, again, this is positive 1, this is negative 1. Halfway between these would be halfway between 0 and pi. That'd be pi over 2. Again, that's typically the quarter point would be at the midline. And then at 3 pi over 2, that's the 3/4 point, we'd be back at the midline also. And that's 1 period of cosine typically. Like if I graphed y equals cosine x, they go through those points. Okay, but we're shifting these things around. We're getting different numbers. We're going to get all these different values. So let's do the same thing that we did before. Let's fix the period. Okay, so the period is affected by the number in front of x. So the period's 2 pi divided by this number in front of x. So 2 pi divided by 2 pi is 1. So that means that this is going to take place between 0 and 1. Okay, this is the halfway point between these, so it's the average of these. So the average of 0 and 1 is a half. Alright, this is the 1/4 point, so it's halfway between here and here. So that's a quarter. And then this is halfway between these two, the end and the middle. So that's going to be 3/4. And so now this is where this thing is going to live, in that tiny little window. Alright, so we fixed the period. Now we're going to fix the amplitude. The amplitude is -4, so that means instead of rising or starting at its peak and going down, now this thing is going to flip over the x-axis and actually start at its minimum and go up. So all these 1s are going to be multiplied by -4. Initially, we'll fix them in just a second with the +1. But we're going to get a -4 times 1, -4 times 1, -4 times -1. Alright, so that's shifted everything that way. And now we're going to adjust for, we could adjust for the horizontal shift here. I would have actually adjusted that before I started moving to the amplitude. There is no horizontal shift here. There's nothing being added or subtracted to the x before the cosine acts on it. So the last thing we're going to do is add 1 to all the y coordinates. So that'll become a -3, a -3, a +5, and then these two guys will be 1s because they're on the midline, and the midline shifted. So there's our cosine function. If I go up here now, it should go through those points, and it does. And so that's our graph of those points. That's where those 5 points are going to go. That's why those 5 points, the quarter period points, are so important for this. I mean, if you're doing it by hand. Obviously, with Desmos, I can just graph it. There it is. All right, you got two choices here. This is sine, this is cosine. Cosine starts at its peak and goes down and back up to its peak. Sine starts at its midpoint, goes up down to the midpoint to its minimum and back up to the midpoint. So that's sine, this is cosine. Alright, so we'll start with cosine. Our amplitude is 4. Alright, our period is 1, so it's already got that built in there. There is no horizontal shift, because again there's nothing being added or subtracted in the parentheses to x, so there's only a vertical shift. So I'm going to change that vertical shift to 1. Alright, and now it's not symmetric at the x-axis, so we can see it goes up to 5 and down. And again, match it up with your graph. So at 1/2, oops, sorry, I need to flip it over the axis. I forgot to do that part. So you can click on that graph and tell it to flip over the x-axis. There we go. And now you can see at -1. Let me start over. Alright, reflect over the axis, and now we want the vertical shift of 1. It's done in a particular order. Now we see at at 1/2 we go up to 5. At 1 we're down here at whatever point that is, -3. And the same thing's happening here. So there's our graph. So just make sure you put it in there the correct order. It's like the order of operations. There will be a squeezing into the graph because that's being multiplied by x. That's going to happen first, and then cosine happens. So that's not affecting the graph because we're talking about what happens to the cosine graph. So that squeezes it in because that's happening first. This is going to stretch it up and down, flip it over the axis, and then finally the last thing that's going to happen is the vertical shift. So when I'm graphing it, I just need to make sure that I do it in that order.